Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. Today we're checking out the Asus ROG Strix XG27UCG, the second dual-mode IPS LCD gaming monitor that I've had hands-on time with. The 27-inch panel used here is a native 4K 160Hz display, but after a couple of button presses it transforms into a 1080p 320Hz display, unlocking a faster refresh rate and better motion clarity for competitive gamers. The idea here is that a single monitor can offer both a high resolution and very high refresh rate through dual mode, making it highly versatile for many different use cases. If you've been following the channel closely, you might recall that I tested the Dell Alienware AW2725QF a couple of weeks ago, which also packs a dual mode LCD panel. The Asus variant isn't quite the same in its specifications and panel hardware. The refresh rate is a bit lower, dropping the 4K mode from 180 to 160Hz and the 1080p mode from 360 to 320Hz. And its HDR capabilities are even worse, dropping from Display HDR 600 certification to just Display HDR 400 with lower brightness and fewer edge-lit dimming zones. But I don't think either of these reductions are deal breakers, and Asus are offering their model at a lower $500 US price point, which is more in line with other 4K LCDs these days. From a design perspective, the XG27UCG looks very similar to other Asus ROG Strix monitors. The front display section sees the panel surrounded by slim bezels on three sides and a prominent chin along the bottom edge with an ROG logo in the center. The rear of the display section is the usual gamery sort of thing that Asus seem to love. I'm not as much of a fan of it, but I will admit that the newer RGB LED design for the large ROG logo looks pretty great. The stand supports height, tilt, swivel and pivot adjustment, though the maximum height on offer is only average. The general build quality is pretty good. Most of the outer surfaces are a standard grey plastic, but this is fine enough, and the squarish base has a slot to store your phone. I much prefer this stand base than the three-legged design that Asus uses on their more premium monitors. The screen coating is a very standard matte finish for an IPS LCD, which you'll probably have experienced before on other monitors. It has a light to moderate amount of coating grain and does a great job of minimizing mirror reflections, although obviously it diffuses light in brighter environments. Given that you might want to use this sort of display for desktop productivity work, I think the choice to go with this sort of matte finish makes sense. For port selection, we're getting one DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC, one HDMI 2.1 48GB/s port, and one USB-C supporting DP Alt mode, though power delivery tops out at just 15 watts, which is not sufficient for charging most laptops. There are no other USB ports here, no USB hub, and therefore no KVM switch functionality either. The OSD is controlled through a directional toggle on the rear panel, and it includes Asus's typical feature set, which is quite good with its range of gaming specific features like crosshairs, sniper mode, so on, in addition to color controls and a fully unlocked color space emulation setting. The interface is fast and it's easy to navigate. Now, the big selling point to the XG27UCG is its dual mode functionality, where you can switch between 4K 160Hz and 1080p 320Hz at the press of a button. To be more accurate on the Asus model, it's a couple of button presses. They have mapped one of the action buttons near the directional toggle to the frame rate boost option, but it takes a second press of the joystick to actually get it to switch over, so that's a bit of a slower process than the other models, but not a huge deal or anything. On this monitor, like other dual mode displays, color performance and general panel characteristics are identical in both modes, and all OSD settings carry over between the 4K and 1080p configurations. Your PC will identify each mode as its own unique display, which is perfect for game compatibility and prevents games accidentally using the wrong mode when you don't want it to. The Asus model operates a little differently to the Dell model in some key areas. The Dell model has a setting that allows you to use a separate group of settings in the 1080p and 4K modes, but the Asus model doesn't have that sort of feature, so you're always using the same settings in both modes. This isn't ideal for tuning response time performance, as the overdrive settings are applied differently in the 4K and 1080p configurations. This is another key difference to the Dell model, where at the same refresh rate you get the same performance with the same overdrive setting in the 4K and 1080p modes. On the Asus model, overdrive setting 10, for example, actually gives you different response times in the 4K and 1080p modes at the same refresh rate, like 144Hz, for example. For the resolution experience, Asus do not use integer scaling in the 1080p mode. For one 1080p pixel, I spotted up to 6 native 4K pixels being activated. This doesn't necessarily make the panel look much worse than one using integer scaling, but it's not the clearest presentation, and for any sort of use case that requires resolution, you'll definitely want to use the 4K mode. For gaming, the 1080p mode is perfectly fine and usable. Let's take a look at response time performance, and due to the complexities of this display, I'm just going to simplify things and look at the best configurations in the 4K and 1080p modes. So I'll start with 4K. At the maximum 160Hz refresh rate, I found an overdrive setting of 13 to be the best, although this is only a very minor improvement over the default setting of 10. And for adaptive sync gamers, you probably won't want to use a setting of 13 because at lower refresh rates, it has noticeable overshoot issues. For most gamers using the 4K mode, the default variable overdrive setting of 10 is the best. It's about 1 millisecond slower than using 13 at 160Hz, but it maintains acceptable refresh rate compliance, and this setting is very usable all the way down to 60Hz, giving us a single overdrive mode experience in the 4K mode. In fact, I'd say this is quite a well-tuned experience as far as 4K IPS LCDs go. In the 1080p mode, leaving the overdrive setting on 10 will not be sufficiently fast enough for the 320Hz refresh rate with poor refresh compliance. I found a setting of 16 to be the best at 1080p 320Hz, and here we see an average response time of 4.5 milliseconds with acceptable refresh compliance and a low inverse ghosting rate. With the ability to fine-tune the overdrive setting, it's good to see we can achieve a nice level of performance at this refresh rate, and this does allow for a noticeable step up in motion clarity relative to the 4K 160Hz configuration. Using an overdrive setting of 16 is usable for most of the 1080p refresh rate range that matters, the zone between 160 and 320Hz, which is the only time you'd actually consider using this setting. However, in a broader sense, at lower refresh rates, 16 has quite a lot of overshoot, so from that perspective, it doesn't allow for a single overdrive mode experience. And if you turn the setting down to about 9, which is great for lower refresh rates at 1080p, it's not fast enough for the higher refresh rates. This level of performance and overdrive setup is pretty good, but it falls short of being a seamless experience. There is one mode that's great for 4K gaming and one mode that's highly suited to the types of 1080p gaming you do on this panel, but that setting is not the same and you can't set a different setting for each resolution mode. This means for the best experience, you'll have to change both the frame rate boost setting and the variable OD setting when moving between modes. In that sense, this probably isn't a single overdrive mode monitor, but it's better configured than the Dell model, which had a much more limited and less performant 1080p mode. Compared to other monitors at their maximum refresh rate, the Asus XG27UCG comes reasonably well configured. Its 4K 160Hz mode is better tuned than the 4K 180Hz mode on the Dell AW2725QF, and overall performance is pretty similar to other 4K gaming monitors like the LG 27GR93U. Its 1080p mode is also faster than the 1080p mode on the Dell variant, so it does end up giving better motion clarity in that configuration generally speaking, though I wouldn't say the differences are astronomical when we're talking about a 1 millisecond response time discrepancy. Average performance across the refresh rate range is also pretty good. The 4K mode is one of the better tuned experiences you can get, slightly outperforming the Asus XG27UCS and LG 27GR93U. However, on average, the 1080p mode is pretty similar to the Dell model, both having issues delivering solid performance across the entirety of the refresh rate range in that configuration. What we find in terms of cumulative deviation is that the XG27UCG is pretty good, but it isn't substantially different to other 4K gaming monitors on average. It's on the better end of the scale, and in the 4K mode it delivers a nice single overdrive mode experience, but the level of clarity it provides in that configuration isn't going to be worlds different to something like the Gigabyte M27U. Asus also provide backlight strobing in the form of ELMB sync, which works alongside adaptive sync simultaneously. In the 1080p configuration at 320Hz, this feature works okay, but is still a bit blurry due to strobe crosstalk, so I don't think it looks substantially clearer than the normal mode at the same refresh rate. Using regular ELMB, as opposed to ELMB sync, is better and probably good enough for some competitive gaming, although clarity isn't in the same ballpark as the best strobe displays. In the 4K mode, ELMB is a little more useful, as the normal experience is less clear than at 320Hz, so backlight strobing is providing a larger clarity improvement. There is still some red fringing, which is noticeable at 160Hz, but it's pretty well tuned. ELMB sync though is not as good and has noticeable strobe crosstalk, so in both configurations, I'd stick to the normal ELMB mode without adaptive sync if you want to use backlight strobing. Input lag is excellent in both the 1080p and 4K modes, delivering less than 1 millisecond of processing delay in both configurations. For any sort of latency-sensitive, fast-paced gaming, the 1080p mode is the way to go thanks to its low lag and great refresh rate. Power consumption is pretty good on the XG27UCG, ending up in the ballpark of other recent IPS LCD monitors and delivering a very similar result to the Dell model. Some monitors using other panels are a little more efficient these days, like the Asus XG27UCS, but on the whole this is a decent showing. Color performance is next, and in terms of color gamut, this is a typical wide gamut IPS LCD. 95% coverage of DCI-P3 and 71% coverage of Rec 2020 is very similar to most other 4K gaming monitors. The exceptions to this are monitors using quantum dot enhanced panels. Default out-of-the-box performance is decent, especially in grayscale, where there was little to no obvious color temperature issues and good adherence to sRGB gamma, which led to low delta E's. However, for saturation and color checker, we run into the usual issues where the out-of-the-box experience is not locked to sRGB, so SDR content is expanded to fill the wide color gamut, and this causes oversaturation. Relative to other gaming monitors, grayscale performance is excellent, and color checker is pretty good as well. Asus provide a fully unlocked sRGB mode, which can be enabled through changing the display's color space to sRGB. This provides great sRGB emulation while still allowing you to tweak other settings like white balance if necessary. But on this display, you probably won't need to change much, as the sRGB mode performs really well with low delta E's across our tests. Compared to other monitors, sRGB mode performance is mid-table for grayscale and excellent for color checker, which puts the monitor in the upper group of 4K LCDs that I've tested in terms of factory calibration. For a lot of users, this is the best way to run the monitor, and it doesn't really need much additional calibration. Still, I did put the display through CalMan to software calibrate it and ended up with some fantastic results. IPS LCDs are still some of the easiest displays to calibrate and typically end up with solid results for work in either sRGB or P3, although the total color gamut is nothing amazing here. Maximum brightness tops out at 450 nits, which is pretty good. That should be more than enough for most use cases and right in line with what Asus offers in the XG27UCS. Minimum brightness of 74 nits is on the high side though. Usually I'm looking for less than 50 nits in that metric. Native panel contrast is pretty much what I expected given the results I previously achieved with the AW2725QF. The XG27UCG came in with a result of 1120:1, which is a slightly better than usual result from a modern IPS LCD. It's good to confirm a result above 1000:1, given that some IPS panels do produce rather mediocre results, like we saw from the Gigabyte M27U and LG 27GR93U. However, in general, this display has a poor contrast ratio relative to other display technologies such as VA LCDs and OLEDs. I was very satisfied with the viewing angles available on this monitor with no concerns during regular usage. Uniformity was also pretty good. I noticed a little bit of fall off along the left and right edges, but nothing that was too bad for gaming or productivity apps. I'd say this is a pretty standard LCD experience once again. A quick note here on HDR performance. The XG27UCG doesn't really have sufficient hardware for a good HDR experience, given that it has just 8 edge-lit dimming zones and brightness in the HDR mode tops out at just 480 nits. This results in a bad HDR presentation that lacks the level of contrast and brightness that's required to make HDR actually look good. For this reason, I would not purchase this display if you're interested in solid HDR. The reason why I bring this up here is that its main competitor, the Dell AW2725QF, does have better HDR capabilities. The edge-lit zone count is increased from 8 to 24 on that model, and brightness increases to nearly 750 nits in the best cases. The Dell variant is still not a very good HDR monitor, with only semi-HDR capabilities and plenty of issues associated with using edge-lit local dimming, but it outperforms the XG27UCG comfortably. In the Hub Essentials checklist, Asus generally do a good job of advertising this monitor, with the exception of HDR, which is really more like a fake HDR monitor, and the usual response time claims that don't hold up. In the feature support matrix, we see a pretty typical showing for an IPS LCD that doesn't really support HDR in any meaningful way. I gave Asus a borderline result for single overdrive mode experience because you can achieve that in the 4K mode, but across the 4K and 1080p modes you still need to do some sort of switching around of settings. Also, 60Hz input lag at 4K is below 1 millisecond but above 1 millisecond at 1080p. It's unclear whether the monitor supports firmware upgrades, as it doesn't have any USB ports. It is possible to update a display over display port, but if I had to guess, I'd say it's not supported. Overall, the Asus ROG Strix XG27UCG is a pretty good 4K LCD gaming monitor with the added benefit of dual mode functionality. If you want a display that provides a high degree of versatility, this monitor is certainly one to consider. It offers a 4K resolution for productivity tasks, web browsing and single player gaming, and a faster, clearer 1080p 320Hz mode if you also enjoy competitive gaming. This allows a single display setup to best tackle all types of gaming, adding to the typical 4K LCD package we get from other monitors. The key selling point to this display really is that dual mode functionality, which, like we've seen from other monitors, works pretty well. Response times are optimized for both the 4K 160Hz and 1080p 320Hz modes, so you can get the best out of both configurations. The 320Hz mode provides superior motion clarity and better input lag, so it is of genuine benefit. Color performance is identical between the two configurations, and switching between the modes is relatively hassle-free. I think this concept works even better on an LCD than it does on an OLED because LCDs are highly suited to desktop tasks and productivity. With the XG27UCG, you get a single monitor for work during the day and multiplayer gaming at night. However, I would have liked to see the option to configure each mode separately to really dial in the best experience for each type of use case. On this Asus monitor, it's the same settings for both modes. What's also pleasing to see is that if you don't care too much about dual mode or end up not using it that much, the XG27UCG is a great 4K gaming monitor in its own right. The 4K configuration is as good as other options, with great response time tuning, excellent factory calibration, an unlocked sRGB mode, single overdrive mode experience, and classic IPS LCD benefits like good viewing angles and brightness. Adding dual mode has not compromised the experience. The main competition to this display is the Dell Alienware AW2725QF, and in my opinion, the XG27UCG is the better product. Yes, the refresh rate is a little lower, and its HDR capabilities have been cut back, but Asus have done a better job of nailing the dual mode brief. The XG27UCG is better tuned in its 1080p mode, response times are adequately fast, and there's backlight strobing support. The Asus variant is also cheaper at $500 US versus $600 for the Dell model, and in my review of the AW2725QF, I felt it was simply too expensive at that price. At $500 US, I think the XG27UCG is in a fine position. Not amazing, not a product I'd rush out to purchase, but it's reasonable. You're paying about $100 US more, or 25% more, than a product like the Gigabyte M27U to gain access to dual mode, and the 4K side of the experience is better as well. It's much better value than Asus's own XG27UCS that lacks dual mode support, but at $80 more than the LG 27GR93U, there is still a premium associated with that added feature. So ultimately, I think most buyers that just want a 4K gaming monitor and don't care for the 1080p 320Hz mode are just going to stick to existing great value choices that sit closer to $400 US. But if you do think you'll benefit from dual mode, if you do a lot of competitive gaming, I think the price premium could be justified, and it doesn't feel nearly as outrageous as what Dell were attempting to charge with their variant. So from that perspective, the Asus XG27UCG is reasonable. Anyway, that does it for this review. If you want to support our independent testing that we do here at Monitors Unboxed, then please consider supporting the channel via our Patreon page, which is available via the links below. If you sign up, you get access to some pretty cool benefits, like the ICC calibrated profiles that we create during these reviews. So if you want that calibrated experience, you can go get that from us. We've also got our Discord community, great place to chat about monitors, get recommendations, and of course, chat about all sorts of other PC stuff in there as well. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.